Hello, my name's Dylan and welcome to part 3 of the LensFlare shader tutorial for cycles. In this tutorial we'll be looking at how to set up the node compositor to automatically mask out the lens flare when objects pass in front of it. To see an example of this we can step through this animation here where we can see the spaceship passes in front of the lens flare, and you can see the lens flare disappears when the object moves in front of it. It then reappears as the object is not masking it anymore, and we can see that it again disappears as this wing passes in front of it. And you can even see that there's a slight fade out effect that you can get. It's almost a two-step attenuation effect there. Now this is all done automatically in the compositor, and we'll be looking at during this tutorial how to set up the compositor to achieve this. Another example of this masking effect can be seen in this small video here. We can see here as the trees pass in front of the lens flare, its intensity is attenuated, and we can move on through the animation there. It's completely blocked out, and then it's blinking automatically as the branches of the tree pass in front of the lens flare. Being able to set up the compositor to automatically achieve this effect is quite useful, because even though the effect could be achieved, for example, by keying this intensity value in an animation, which is still available as an option, just hit I on there to set a keyframe. It's much easier, of course, if the compositor can do all that type of work for you for complex scenes. Before continuing, a big thanks to Kuhn Industries for modeling and uploading the shuttle that we can see here up onto BlendSwap. If anyone would like a copy of the shuttle, of course, then just load up BlendSwap, and you can type in text transport shuttle textured, and the model is there for download. So thanks again to Kuhn Industries. The LensFlare shader that we're using today is also available on BlendSwap. You can just go into BlendSwap and type in LensFlare, and a variety of LensFlare options will come up, and one of them will be the LensFlare shader with real-time preview by iReboot. And anyone who's downloaded the shader and looked at the masking example that's included in the blend file, this was the first mask node that was ever used, the automated masking node. And like most node setups, it's evolved a little bit, and this is a screenshot here of the first mask, and there's quite a few elements to it. There's some ID masking going along here, there's some blurring and color ramping, and eventually there's an output that decides how much of the lens flare to add into the final composite. And while this mask setup worked quite well, it was a little bit slower, and in the evolution it then moved to something a little like this that was used for the space scene that we've just seen. Although the masking now is simpler, the nodes, looks like there are a lot of nodes here, but the actual automated lens flare mask is just this area here. And this method turned out to be a lot quicker because it wasn't using a blur node. We'll get into some of these details later. And the version that we're going to look at today, which achieves pretty much the same effect, is this setup, and the automated masking has now been reduced to just these three elements here. So you can just leap ahead and set these up if you want to, but we'll be setting it up from scratch and going through into how it works, because there'll be a lot of variants that you can use to achieve this type of effect, and so understanding how it's achieved will probably let you get the results that you want. Just as an overview of where we're heading with this tutorial, we know that we would like this lens flare element to blank out when it passes behind some objects, or any objects that we choose. And in a simple compositing node setup, essentially the job we want it to do is we want to reduce this factor here down to 0 to make the lens flare disappear. And if we look at it on the 3D view, if I move the light position empty behind Suzanne, the effect that we want is for the lens flare to completely disappear. Now, you'll never get that in the preview because the preview doesn't use the compositor, But if I render the scene out, we can see it rendering now. Then first it's rendering Suzanne, now it's going to render the lens flare layer, and you can see that the resulting image does not have the lens flare in it. Okay, let's open up a new copy of Blender and set up the scene with the LensFlare shader. If you already know how to do this and just want to jump straight ahead to the compositing section, then feel free to do so. I'll put a time stamp in the text at the bottom of the YouTube video so you can just jump ahead. But I'll try and move through pretty quickly on this setup. So if it's too fast, then feel free to look at tutorial number 2 again, where it goes through a lot slower for the setup. Okay, now the first thing we need to do is actually get a copy of the OSL shader. If you haven't got one already, you can get it from a few places. You can go, and if you download the LensFlare shader from Blend Swap, there is a copy of the text file that contains the shader in the blend file, and I'll show you in this tutorial how to get a copy of it. Also from Blend Swap, if you find this LensFlare download, there are some links that will allow you to get the shader as well. For instance, if you go to the blog link, if we open that up, called Blend Bits, and if we scroll down a bit further, you can actually see here's the shader source code, and if you want to get a copy of it, we just scroll to the bottom, we choose View Raw and select the whole lot and just copy it, and we can paste that into Blender. That's one way to get it. The other way to get it is if we open text editor here, and in the we could just paste, we could go new and paste in the code that we just uploaded. That's one option. Or another option is we could append it from the file that we downloaded from Blend Swap. So if you've already downloaded that example file, you choose append, and then you find out where the actual download is, and here it is, LensFlare OSL example. So let's open that. We go into the text, and you can see there's the LensFlare, and this it's 1.1.osl in this case. So we link and append it, and now when we look in the text file, we down here we can see that we have the OSL file. So that's the two ways to get it. Either just paste it in directly into the text editor in Blender, or append it from some other file. So that's the first step done. So let's go back to the 3D view, and let's set up the scene. So in the time-honored tradition, we will delete the cube. Now I'll just turn on, we can see the screen keys down here for people who are new to the system. So I'm right clicking on the cube, pressing X and choosing delete. I'm going to also delete this light to begin with. And where we're heading with this is we want to set up this type of scene here. We've got a camera, we want to put a LensFlare plane in front of the camera, which we're going to put the shader material onto. And in this example, the 3D scene is just a photograph of the planet, and then we're going to add an empty that we're going to use to define where the lens flare starts from, where the bloom starts from, and we're going to add some drivers into the shader so that when we move the empty around, the lens flare position will move around also. So let's jump into it. We want to hit 5 to get into orthographic view, 3 to look from sideways. Now we want to put the camera into the origin. You don't have to do this, but if you're starting off with the LensFlare shader, it's just much easier to do it this way. So Alt G to right click the camera to select it, Alt G to jump it to the center, Alt R to reset the rotation. So now it's pointing in a defined rotation. And if we hit 7 to see the top view, and I'm going to Shift A, I want to add a plane. This is going to be our LensFlare plane. Now we want to move this plane. At the moment we can see, find a good view, we want to move it slightly in front of the camera. So I'm just going to press G and then Z to bring it in front. It doesn't matter too much where it is, but just as long as it's roughly in front. Unless you've got depth of field set, of course, then you want to put the plane at the depth of field. Now before we go ahead, let's just do a little bit of housekeeping and set up some windows that we're going to use. I'm going to make the camera view up here, so I'm going to hit the 0 key. So now we're looking through the camera in this view, and I want to size this plane so it just fits in front of the camera. So if I hit 0 down here as well, put it in wireframe mode with this plane selected, we hit S to scale it and bring it down to one of the sides. It's just slightly larger than the camera, so this axis looks good. Now I'm going to go scale Y, S, Y to roughly make the plane about just slightly bigger than the camera view. You don't have to be very accurate with this, it just has to be slightly bigger. Now the next step is we want to parent the plane to the camera. So left click the plane and then shift, if we hit A to deselect everything, we can click on the plane up here to get it, and then shift right click the camera and control P and object parenting object keep transform. And now if we rotate the camera, the plane will rotate with it, as we can see here. So we don't want that rotation. We want to rotate it now in the x-axis by 90 degrees. So with the camera selected, R, X, 90. So now it's pointing in the way that we want it. Now we're going to do a few more housekeeping things. Under camera, we're going to rename our plane LensFlare plane. You can name it what you want, but LensFlare plane makes sense. LensFlare plane. And I forgot to mention a few things on the last tutorial. You can probably get away with them, but I think it's useful. So we click the object icon here, and we want to set some of the visibility properties for the LensFlare plane. So we go down to ray visibility, and we want to turn off diffuse, glossy, shadow, and transmission, because once we apply the shader to it, we only want the camera visibility selected. And I'm just going to save this now as tutorial 3. Tutorial 3, and I already have one there, so I'll call it tutorial 3B. So now we can save that. Let's do some more housekeeping. Let's make the background totally black. So we go up to the Earth icon here, the world settings, and whether you can use nodes or not use nodes, it doesn't really matter, but just change the color to black, so that'll be darker when we render it out. And also for the LensFlare plane, if we click on LensFlare plane, click on the object settings, and we want to set the display just to bounds, and that means on these previews we'll be able to see it through, see through in X-ray mode much more clearly. Okay, so that's the first step done. Now the next step is to apply the material that we want to the plane, and this material has the LensFlare shader on it. Now, so with LensFlare plane selected, we now click on materials and go new, and over here we'll select a node editor and hit the N key, and we need to select the actual object icon down here. And now we can see here's the node setup. It's just a standard diffuse material. We want to replace the diffuse material with our shader, so we hit X and Shift A to add the shader script. So go down, Shift A, script, choose script, and now we should be able to find that shader OSL file that we loaded into the text file before. In the previous tutorial we used the external script file. So if you've saved this to disk, for instance, you can save the OSL file to any drive you want, and then just load it up from the drive. Or you can choose the internal. The internal has the advantage that it's easier to distribute your blends without having to send extra files. So we'll use the internal in this case. And we know the shader's working because we can we can see all these input-output nodes. If you ever want to recompile or set defaults, just hit this button here and it sets everything to defaults. So it's as simple as setting up, connecting the output to the material surface output, and the shader is almost ready to go. Now this is a step I always forget in the render settings. If you go to render it now, you won't see anything at all. And it's because you need open shading language from the render settings under the camera icon. You need to click that. If on your computer you can see a box that says GPU, CPU, then it has to be set to CPU before you'll be able to turn on open shading language. So turn off GPU, the graphics processing unit, set it to CPU, and then enable shading, open shading language. Otherwise you won't be able to see anything. Now at this point, if we select render from the preview from here, then we can see our LensFlare shader. So it's starting to work right now. Now with some versions of Blender, I've noticed you can get crashes when running these preview screens, and so often it's fine often to move the empties around, but I find if you make material changes with the preview open, sometimes it crashes, and I'm not exactly sure whether it's the script doing it or just some of the versions of Blender, or a mixture of both. Another thing I neglected to say in the previous tutorial is we want to set up this view window here to be pretty much the same aspect ratio as our final scene. If I use my scroll wheel to zoom this in and out, we want to finely tune the size of this preview window to be roughly the same aspect ratio as our final scene. And the reason for that is if I hit render now, if I render the scene out, this will be quite a slow render. We'll speed this up in a moment by setting up render layers. But it works out that if your preview aspect ratio matches the aspect ratio of the final render, then you get the exact one-to-one correspondence of all these dots. They should match exactly what you get in the render. But if there's a massive difference between the preview aspect ratio and the final render size aspect ratio, then while you will still see a LensFlare in the preview, there will be a few differences between that final render and what you preview. So it's always a good idea to experiment with that a little bit, just to pull these edges out, and you can see as you change the preview we're getting slightly different features. I haven't been able to code that effect out, and I think it's because the preview pane here is the actual camera. It's actually a slightly different camera than the one that is used, so to speak, for the final render, and I haven't worked out a way to easily negate that effect. I imagine it's possible to write an add-on to actually set this window by the click of a button to be exactly the correct size. Okay, let's move on with the next part. The next job to do is to speed up the render times. You'll notice, as before, if we go to do the render, this is very slow compared to the speed you may have seen earlier on in the tutorials. And the reason that it's slow is at the moment the render settings are set to 10 for a final render and 10 for a preview. However, it doesn't need to be set to 10, it just needs to be set to 1 for the shaders. If I go to render it now, we can see this is much quicker. You can see the shader draws in a couple of seconds for actually quite a large render here. So for this tutorial I'm going to do a couple of things. One, I'm going to set the output dimensions to 25% just so we can do much faster previews. But because we actually want to put some 3D elements in our scene, we can't actually leave the render samples at 1. Otherwise, any 3D elements we put in our scene are just not going to be very clear. But we will leave the preview at a low number for the stage. So the way to make our final renders much faster is to set up some render layers where the shader is put on its own render layer that just renders with one pass, and all your normal 3D elements are put on any other layers you want, just with the normal render samples. So the way that we add some layers is, well, first of all we have to put, if we deselect everything, if we right click the LensFlare plane, let's decide that this layer here that I'm pointing at is going to be the render layer for the LensFlare. So we right click to select the plane, we press M to bring up the move layer, and then we click the layer that we want to move it onto, and then let's just make sure that we shift click the new layer just so it's included in the scene. Now we want to come up here and choose the render layers icon, and we want to create a new render layer by pressing plus, and let's name this render layer LensFlare. So render layer LensFlare, you can call it whatever you like. And we want this LensFlare render layer only to render the layer that we put the LensFlare plane on. So just click that layer there. And we want to override the default samples. If it's set to 0, it just uses the global number of samples, like 10, 50, 1,000, whatever you set it to. But we just want to have one pass, so we just type in 1, and we don't need the environment. Other things that we're going to do is we just want this render layer to produce an emission pass, so we can turn off combined, turn off Z, and just have the emission pass, and we'll do a save at this point. Now we also want to make a few changes to the main render layer, so we can click render layer here, and of course we don't want our main 3D element render layer to be rendering this layer here with our LensFlare plane on it, so we shift click it to make sure it doesn't render that, and let's just save the file at this point. Now if I hit render, we should have the two render layers. If I start it up, we can see we don't have any 3D elements in our scene, so maybe we can just fix that right now. If we come into this area here, hit 7, move the cursor in front of the camera, let's get rid of that stuff, move the cursor in front of the camera, and by left clicking in here, Shift A, mesh, and let's add the monkey Suzanne, and if we hit 0 we can see Suzanne in the screen. So let's just grab Suzanne and move her out a bit. We also need some lights in our scene, so I'll just turn this rendering off for the moment. So let's add a quick light to the scene as well. So Shift A, mesh, plane, slightly increase the size of the plane. Let's look at it on the side view, G, Z to grab the plane down a bit. Actually just drag it, G to drag it over here. And I've turned off the rendering at the moment because sometimes when changing these material settings we may get a crash, so I'm just turning it off for the moment as a precaution. Now let's turn that plane into emission. So we've got the plane selected, right click it to select it, going over to the materials selection up here, we're clicking new, and we're going to choose emission from the shader selections. Now where has emission? I've got two ambient emission, there it is. So now we choose emission. So if we the other trick is not to have all these things put on the wrong layer, so I always do that. So if we hit M, let's just move that onto our 3D element layer. Same with Suzanne, right click Suzanne, hit M, move that onto our normal 3D element layer. Save that. So if we do a preview at this point, now hopefully we can see Suzanne in the picture. There we go. So now we've got Suzanne, we've got our LensFlare element, and we've got a light. Now if we render it at this stage, we do a render. First Suzanne will render on the first pass, now the LensFlare. Now if I just make this window a bit bigger, we can see the render layer, we can see Suzanne, and on the LensFlare layer we can see the LensFlare. So the next job is to set up the compositor to composite the lens flare and Suzanne so we can see the combined image. So the way we do that is we choose the node editor and we come along here and we choose the compositing nodes for the scene. So we click this little icon here, we choose use nodes, and we're going to choose use backdrop as well. And we can already see Suzanne is showing on the composite layer, and of course if we do a render, that's all we can see is Suzanne in the final composite. So we need to add another render layer, Shift A, and input render layers. So we have added another render layer, and we want to choose the render layer as our lens flare layer, and so you can see our lens flare. And now we want to add this lens flare, we want to mix it in with the 3D scene. So Shift A, and we go color mix, and if we just lift it, this beautiful system here, if we just lift it up, it's connected the first node for us. And if we click in the render layer from the lens flare, and we want to set the mixing to add, and now we can see using this good trick with the Control Shift click, will show that instantly in the preview there. So this render layer just has the lens flare layer, this render layer just has Suzanne. Here's the adding two of those images together, and here's the final result. And of course if we hit render now, we will see Suzanne, we'll see the lens flare, and that's all good. So the very next step is to get some control over our lens flare. If we go back, if we select our, I'll just save at this point, if we select our lens flare plane, and in a compositor select the objects, we can see our shader again. And if I want to change the position of the lens flare, I can do it directly from this position control here in the shader. So if I just click position and change the X location, you can see that's updating in the preview window. And here I have a crash. This is one of the things when sometimes you change the previews and you get a crash. So I'll just start up Blender again, just a moment. Okay, I've just opened up the file again, and as we're saying, you can edit the light positions from these boxes directly, although it's not advisable because it does seem to crash more often if you just change these vectors directly when in direct preview mode. But a far better way than typing in numbers is to link an empty to drive the position directly, which is pretty stable. So that's the next step that we're going to do. So if we have an overview, if we look from overhead by pressing 7, top down view, and I should just also turn on the screen keys again. There we go. So top view by pressing 7, and let's add an empty to the scene. And so Shift A, and we add an empty and plane axes, and let's just grab it and put it over here somewhere. We click on this object data for the empties and just set it to a size 2 so it's a bit easier to see. And let's click on the other object data and change its name to light position empty. You can call it anything you want, but it just means it's easier to see over here what we're looking at. And let's also make it so it displays its name. So we come down to display and we choose name, so it's much easier to see what's going down here. Let's do some more housekeeping too. Here's our emission plane. Let's just call that low light, just so we know what that is, and we save our file there. So our next big job is to have this empty drive the lens flare plane light position, and here's how we do that. If I just turn off the real-time preview just to reduce the chances of it stopping. Now this is a slight difference from the previous tutorial. I found a much quicker way to do this. We're going to create another window up here and open up the we're going to open up the graph editor. Here it is here, and hit N to see the view properties, and we want to choose drivers from the graph editor. The next thing we're going to do is come down to the light position here, and we're going to right click inside it and choose add drivers, and you'll notice it turns purple, which means that it's ready to have some drivers add into it. If I click onto it now, you can see that the X, Y and Z coordinates are ready to be driven by some values, and here's how we do it. Just before we add the drivers, let's change the material name here to LensFlare material, just so we can know what it is. And let's also just pin it to the view, which is a very handy feature, so it doesn't disappear when we click on other objects. Okay, now up in our drivers view, we can see our LensFlare material, so let's open it up, and let's open up the shader nodes. And now these numbers here, these entries here, correspond to the X, Y and Z entries, and we want to link the light position empty, which we can see here, to this vector, and it's actually quite simple to do. So let's click on the first one up here, left click it, and we're going to scroll down here, and you'll come up to an area where it says drivers, and we're going to repeat the same 3 operations over and over. We're going to find where it says, it will say scripted expression, there'll be a number in there. We want to change that expression number to a variable, var, so it matches the variable that's already there. We want to, let's just make this a bit bigger, we want to link to our light position empty, so click on object / bone and choose light position empty, and it's already set to X, but we want to choose the empty's X location, and now the X location is going to be driven from the empty into the X location here. In the previous tutorial I said we had to delete these modifiers, but we can actually just leave those in place. Now let's click on the Y value, change expression to var, var, enter, so it matches with that. We want to choose light position empty again, and now we want to choose the Y location, and now as you can imagine we click the next one, X, we change the expression to variable, var, so it matches the variable there. We choose light position empty, and now we choose Z location. So let's just double check that we got those. That's Z location, Y location, X location. So now if I just save, and if we choose render, we should see that we can move the empty and see the lens flare position move. So I'm going to grab the empty and bring it down, and excellent, we can see that the lens flare is moving as we would like it to move. There we go. So we've completed the first part of the setup, and if I just choose save, now we're ready to jump into the main thrust of this tutorial, which is how to automatically mask the lens flare. Now before we add in some of the nodes, let's just clean up our screen a bit. So we'll just move this up a little bit longer, a bit higher. Now what we're trying to achieve here is we would like the lens flare to disappear when it is behind any of our 3D elements. If I do a render now, we can see here's a 3D element, here's the lens flare, here's the composited version. Now if I just come into camera mode here, if I move the lens flare behind Suzanne, we will certainly see it in the preview, but what we want when we go to do the final render is we'd like to turn off the lens flare at this point automatically. And if we jump over to the compositor here, you remember from earlier, effectively we want to reduce this factor down to nothing. So if we did a render now, there'll be no lens flare in there. And the way we're going to do that is to set up a special render layer that has a small dot on it, and just as an overview, we're going to parent, it's a small icosphere, but it could be anything at all, anything that is going to show up bright. So a small bright object, we're going to parent it to the to this light position, and this light position is where the bloom ends up. And we're going to set up the render layer such that if there's nothing blocking the small light object that we're going to put there, then the camera will see it on the special render layer that we're going to set up. And we want to set up the nodes so that if the dot is visible, then the factor is going to be 1, and we will get our lens flare. But if the dot is hidden by some object, it's masked, and in this case it's masked by Suzanne. If it's masked, then we want this factor here to be 0. So the first part of this process is creating the dot and putting it on a render layer. So let's move the empty over here, and let's just turn off this automatic preview to reduce any chance of the crashing. So to add the small small disk that we can see, we right click the light position empty, and we go Shift S, and we snap the cursor to the selected. Now the next step is we go Shift A, and we're going to add, you could probably use all sorts of objects. In the very first time I used this, I actually used another lens flare and just used a mini bloom to achieve the effect. But it's actually it's a lot, not a lot faster, but a bit faster if you use the icosphere. So or one of the other objects, but let's put the icosphere in, and if I hit T to bring up the properties panel, let's just choose it to a low subdivision so there's not too much detail on there, and let's scale it down a lot. We only need a very small disk, so let's scale it so it's quite small. Save that. Now we want it to be a light, we want it to emit light, so we come over to the objects, choose new for a new node, and we want to choose an emission shader. So we scale along here till we find emission, and just save that. So now this small dot should emit light, and if we just bring it into the camera view here, let's just grab the light, before we grab the light empty, let's parent the icosphere, which we're going to name right now. Actually, if you click up here, and let's name it to be flare mask. So that's what we're going to call it, and we're actually going to parent it to the light position empty. So if you shift left click light position empty, Control P to parent it, keep the transform. So now that small masking light will actually follow, it will follow this empty around. Let's just bring it into camera view, and if we turn on the rendered view, we can see, and let's just turn off the lens flare as well, so it's not getting in the way, which we can do here. We can see there is indeed a bright light there. I might just scale that down a bit, so I'm going to click the flare mask, hit S, and just bring it down. You can choose what size you want, but I think that size is probably not a bad size, and let's save that. Great, so now we've got our small disk. Oops, and if we bring the light behind Suzanne, as you'd imagine, you can't see it because Suzanne is blocking it. Let's bring up a 3D view here, just so we can see what's going on. So here we can see the light, and as I grab this empty and move it behind Suzanne, Suzanne is actually masking it out. So we've got the first part of the idea working. We've got some mechanism that we can tell is the lens flare behind an object. Now we don't want this actually to show up on the normal render layer. If we do a render now, then we'll get Suzanne, and we'll get this bright light that we don't want to see. So we want to set up a new render layer for the light, so let's do that now. We click over here to, we'll take this off preview mode, save, come over to render layers, create a new render layer, and we're going to call this render layer flare mask. That's going to be our flare mask layer, and we would like to put them, if we select the mask itself just by left clicking up here, we would like to put it on its own special layer because we don't want it to appear in the final composite. So if we go M, and let's choose the layer down here to be the layer that is going to go on. Now the next step is in the render layers themselves, we want the flare mask layer only to render the mask. So we just click that, and correspondingly we've already set up the LensFlare layer to only render this layer. And our 3D elements, we also want to make sure that the 3D element, just our normal 3D scene, doesn't include that masking light. So we shift click that to turn that off. And now if we come to our compositor by selecting node editor and selecting the main compositing nodes, we should be able to set up a new render layer where we just see that light. So there's a couple of ways to do that. We go Shift A, input render layers, or another one is just select one of these layers and go Shift D and duplicate one. And we're going to select that render layer to the mask layer. Now we haven't rendered yet, so let's just do that, and we should see a small dot appear over here. It looks like it's so small that we can't see it, assuming I haven't made a mistake there. Now another thing we should do is on this render layer, let's make it just an emission layer only, and we can turn off Z and turn off combined. Okay, I have made a mistake here. The reason we can't see the dot is that I need to enable it in the render. So we go left click, shift left click, and shift left click. So all these three layers will be included in our final render. And hit F12 and render the 3D scene. We're rendering the lens flare, and we're also rendering that small masking dot that we've added. So we've got our three key render layers set up that we're going to need to achieve the masking. Now, just before proceeding to the next step, let's just do a little bit more housekeeping. For the flare mask render layer, if we just click that, oops, we've got emission selected, but we don't need to have the environment selected. And we also just want to have that set to one sample. It doesn't need 50,000 samples. It just needs one sample. And the other thing that we'll do is if we select that flare mask, which is an emission plane or icosphere, we click Object and we come to Visibility, and we can turn off Glossy and Diffuse and Shadow. And let's just see if we can turn off Transmission as well. Let's just do a render and just check whether it comes up in the final render. It looks like it's still there, so that's okay. So we can just leave the camera visibility on only. Okay, now you remember the key thing is that we would like this small dot, when it passes behind a 3D element's head, we'd like to be able to make it disappear. And how can we do that? If I just move this here now and go render, it's rendering. You can see, if we zoom up here, we can see on this render layer that even though the light is right behind Suzanne, it's still showing up in this render layer. So it isn't masked out yet. If we move the empty back here, render, here is the dot. We move the empty back behind Suzanne, re-render, and the dot is still there. So we need some technique to have this white dot disappear when it passes behind any geometry that we want. So let's just rearrange these render layers, ready to add some new nodes. We'll move the LensFlare up here. Now the way we can do that is by creating a mask around all the 3D elements that we would like to act as masking objects for the dot, and that's quite easy. We can do that by right clicking any of our objects in our scene, and we come along to we select object up here, and we must set we can give it an object pass number, and let's just find out where it is. If we go into relations here, you'll see there's something called pass index 0, and we can essentially give all the 3D elements in the scene their own IDs. They can all be given the same ID if they want. For instance, in the tree example earlier, all the trees had the same ID. So let's just make up a number, and we'll call it 15. So in the render layer, if we come up here and click render layer, we can enable the object index as one of the outputs from the render layer. So if we click it, you can see that over here in the compositing view, now we have an object index output. Now if I do a render from here, and then Control Shift click this node with the background selected, that's the image alpha. You can see now that I should just say that Control Shift click is this nifty shortcut that a commenter on YouTube left. Thank you so much, it's such a good thing. It automatically hooks up a viewer node to whatever you click, so you can see now it's hooked up to there. We can look at the dot, we can look at Suzanne. It's a very handy tip. So we left click. So by setting the pass index to 15, and in the render layers enabling the object index to appear at the render layer here, now we can see that there is a masking shape for Suzanne. But if we had hundreds of elements in here, we might see lots and lots of masking elements, and we just want to separate Suzanne out specifically, and we can do that by using an ID mask. So we can add one of those. We go Shift A, and then we want to add the ID mask. Now I've just got to find it. It's under Converter, ID mask. So Shift A, Converter, add ID mask. Now if we set that the ID value to 15, and we hook up the index, the object index, to the ID value, sorry, so and we set the index up here to 15, that's what we should do. Now if I Control Shift click, we can see that we can still see the Suzanne mask, but it's the only one getting through. If we change this mask to 16, nothing gets through. If we change it to 14, so this way we can mask out easily any objects in our scene. You can choose anti-aliasing if you want to make these edges a bit smoother. For what we're doing here, anti-aliasing isn't important at all. Now that we have our mask node in, we can add a multiply node and multiply the output of the mask layer, which we can see here, which is the white outline of Suzanne in this case, by our small white dot, which is on its own special layer here, the flare mask layer. Now I'm going to add the node first, and then we can talk through and see how it works. So just move some of these things out of the way just so we can see a little bit clearer. To add the mask, to add the multiply node, we go Shift A, Converter, choose Math. Now we want to zoom up here so we can see what's going on. Now we want to choose Multiply. We want to connect the output of the ID mask to one of the inputs of the multiply, and the output of our small dot render layer here into the other node of the multiply, the other input of the multiplier node. And so what we're doing, if we just move these out of the way, is we're multiplying this mask by this white dot. Now, where the white dot and the white mask coincide, white represents 1, so 1 times 1, 1 times 1 equals 1. And we can see the white dot gets through. Only the white dot gets through because surrounding the white dot is a black area which has the value 0, and 0 times 1 equals 0. So we can see this effect even more when we move the this white dot from around Suzanne. So let's just turn on the render layer here so we can see what's going on. We can just save, and I'm going to grab this empty and move it along, and you can see up here the white dot appears in the preview. When it's behind Suzanne, it's hidden, and when it's not behind Suzanne, we can clearly see it coming through on this layer. So if we just hit render now, just on this layer, and now we can see here is the white dot, here is the mask, so 1 times 0 equals 0. So now we have a gating effect where our white dot is in the open, if you like, it's being blocked out in the compositor at the moment. And when the white dot is behind Suzanne, if we render that now, so now we are multiplying 1 times 1. When the white dot is behind Suzanne, it's showing, and we can start to use this as a gating effect. Now we can't just invert this and apply it straight to our compositor, where ultimately we want to change the factor of the lens flare here. Ultimately we want some control to lower this factor down. We can't just invert this effect and apply it to this add node yet, because it's only going to affect the lens flare just in the area where this white dot is. We need some way of making this white dot fill the whole screen if it's visible. However, if it is invisible, as it is in this case, if I move the white dot from behind Suzanne into the open, let's just re-render. Now there's nothing coming out of the multiply node, it's all black. We want an all black scene to remain dark, we want it to stay black. However, when the dot is visible, we want it to fill the whole screen. And to do that, we're going to use a dilate erode node. So we go shift add, and then filter, and then choose dilate erode. And we're going to hook up the output of the multiplier, and it's set to step here. Now what this node does, it either erodes a value, it erodes an image, it eats away at it, or dilates it, it makes it bigger. In our case we want to dilate the image, so we have a dot here and we want to dilate it, so let's increase it. As you can see, as we increase the dilation value, the dot is getting bigger, and we want it to fill up the whole image. Now if our rendered image, if the dimension of the rendered image was, for example, 1920 by 1080, then we wanted to dilate the full extent of the image, and you would type in 1920 here. We're only at 25%, so of the full size, so we don't need to dilate by that amount. But there's nothing to stop us from typing that in, so let's just do it anyway. So 1920, and now our small dot has filled the whole screen. What just used to be a small switching element that we couldn't really use to affect the whole image, with this dilation, we say if the dot is there, we're going to fill the screen with white. And if we move this empty away, let's re-render the scene again. Now, because we're multiplying a small dot down here, it's been masked out. 1 times 0 equals 0. So the output of the multiply node is 0, and there's nothing to dilate. You can't increase the size of a black image. You can't make it any whiter, and so we don't see anything. However, when we put the empty back behind Suzanne, re-render, it's finished rendering now. Now we've got our dot again out of the multiply node, and now it's been dilated to fill the whole screen. And so no matter where we are in the image, no matter where the lens flare is, we can now use this 1 as a factor controller for our adding. So let's do now. If we add the output of this the dilate node, which has given us this white switch, if we hook it up to the factor and then look at the rendered result, we see that we have kind of the opposite result we want. Even though the lens flare is behind Suzanne, we can clearly see the lens flare poking out, and we actually want the opposite switch sense as what we have. At the moment, the output from this node is 1, which means that it's fully adding these two together. We would like it to be 0. So to do that, we will add an inverter. We want to invert the white to black. There's probably a couple ways to do it. One way is just to choose color invert. So let's throw that in. Choose an inverter in here. And now if we look at the output node, it is reduced down somewhat, but it is still actually visible. And the reason for that is that the dot that we have over here on this render layer is not actually quite bright enough. If we give it a bit more brightness, so we go to the flare mask and let's increase the brightness to 10, for example, and then let's render that. Now we can see we have exactly the masking we want. So just to go over that again, we are multiplying. If I can zoom up into the image, you may or may not be able to see it on the internet. We're multiplying this white dot by the output of this mask. 1 times 1 equals 1, so the output is 1. But in fact, even though it looks like it was white to us, if we set this back down to a low emission value and just re-render the dot itself, it looks like it is a bright value, but mathematically it's not a 1, it's something like 0.8. And so that even though we are dilating it to fill the screen, this is not a complete white value, and therefore when we invert it, a complete white does not get turned into a complete dark value or a 0, and therefore it's not fully gating the image. Therefore we're ending up with some of the image bleeding through here, which can be quite good. It allows us to give some sensitivity to how the lens flare will disappear. If it's going behind small tree branches, do you want it to completely eliminate the lens flare, or just attenuate the effect? Like it is here. For example, if we bring up the lens flare right to the edge, for example, and render the scene, you may actually want it so that you end up with a little bit just poking out. But in this case it's too low, so let us just set that up to a higher value, and let's move the position back behind Suzanne, re-render again. And now you'll see our lens flare is entirely masked out. And so just to move that node out of the way, we have a reasonably simple setup and quite a fast setup for automatically masking out the lens flare when it passes behind 3D objects. Let's just go. So I hope all that made sense. And as you can see from the history of the node noodles, there are a lot of ways to achieve this. This icosphere, for example, that we used to make our sphere mask, you could try different shapes, and certainly different sizes will have different effects on on how the lens flare actually blends out, and feel free to experiment. I hope this has been useful. Thank you very much.